I am so conservative.
Rationalized in my head. These are things I read in
And
the
I'm going to talk about Willow Creek.
Okay.
Willow Creek, a few years back, had invited.
Remembered at the time when Will Rogers said, I don't belong to any organized religion. I'm a Baptist.
Yeah.
I am so conservative. If you didn't jump to conclusions, you might not get any exercise. I am so conservative. And welcome to the Unknown Webcast. What am I doing here? I'm getting lost. Oh, yeah, okay. This is just a bit of a trigger warning for those who believe words are more injurious than sticks and stones. I really am so conservative, I can't turn left even when I'm driving. In addition to giving trigger warnings to our viewers, Ron Hensel and I both drink coffee for your protection.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. And I think Doug Groothuis is as well. Today, Dr. Doug Groothuis joins us to talk about his latest book, Fire in the Streets. My name is Don Vino. I'm president of Midwest Christian Outreach Inc. in Wonder Lake, Illinois, which produces the Unknown Webcast, and our senior reacher and researcher.
I'm Jack Reacher. I'm that big
Jack Reacher, and he's researching. Is Ron Hensel, who will introduce the sponsors of today's webcast. And here is Ronnie, baby.
Well, I hope it's mostly peaceful fire in the streets. Greetings from sunny Florida, where, let's do this here, the palm tree came out, saw its shadow, and now we have 12 more months of summer. Our sponsor for this edition of the Unknown Webcast is the Grievance Industrial Complex, because things are never bad enough already. Our regular legal disclaimer, our guest on today's webcast, insert name here, that would be Dr. Douglas Groothuis, has no connection whatsoever to any of the satirical content of the Unknown Webcast here referred to as webcast, although we probably will not mention it again. The satirical content includes any and all commercials, end credits, puns, smart remarks, or anything else that might fall under the definition of satire. In the meantime, Midwest Christian Outreach bears no liability for or responsibility for anyone's opinions regarding this satirical content. Our regular announcements notice: the opinions expressed on this webcast are ours and should be yours too. If you enjoy it, or if it really annoys you and you want to inflict it on somebody else to ensure your continued access, please go to midwestoutreach.org, click the yellow donate button, and contribute as you feel led. But do not fear, this webcast is Y2K compliant, and don't forget to subscribe to us on your favorite video channels. Welcome. Fake applause. This is the fakest applause you can get because I'm faking fake applause.
You were faking the fake applause.
So
yeah,
one day we will take one step up and actually have fake applause.
So we have Dr. Groothuis here, and I'm going to. What am I going to do here? I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to share the screen because I want people to know what we're talking about, since we don't often know what we're talking about. Fire in the streets. How you can confidently respond to incendiary cultural topics. Now, the first thing I'm going to ask for you to do, Dr. Groothuis, just for those who may be unaware, what does incendiary even mean?
Yeah, it means basically controversial. It means fiery, something that can catch fire. So the metaphor of fire carries through the whole book, basically.
We didn't start that fire, did we?
Well, not really. I mean, you want to talk about the fire in the streets of 2020, we're talking about literal fire, several billions of dollars worth of damage, 20 or 30 people killed, state buildings taken over, burned down.
But no mean tweets.
Yeah, right. So that is really what got me to write the book. Is in the summer of 2020, my wife Kathleen and I were in rural Alaska, and we were monitoring as closely as we could what was going on in what we Alaskans call the lower 48. Yeah. And there were a few legitimately peaceful protests in Anchorage, I think. But our city of Denver was being raided. The Capitol was being defaced. The governor was doing nothing to stop the rioters for about 6 weeks. So I really wondered if we should come back. I thought maybe we should just stay in rural Alaska where we're safe and I can just do my classes at Denver Seminary by Zoom. But
works, right?
Yeah, it's literally out in the Alaskan woods, and we're off the road, and Kathleen's brother has a nice gun collection. So
very helpful.
We wondered if he lives on the property, by the way. We wondered if we should come back. That's how severe things were. And I kept getting questions about the roots of this philosophically. So I decided I'd like to write a book. I'd like to find a publisher who would promote it avidly and get it out quickly. And that's what happened with Salem Books. So this book just came out 2 weeks ago, Fire in the Streets.
We are going to use your table of contents as a guide, as we mentioned. So how did this blaze get started? I see.
Right.
You actually say that it's fire in the mind of Karl Marx and his followers. So. Right.
Well, it's not some kind of a trick to say that the violent riots of 2020 have their roots ultimately in Marxism. The leaders of Black Lives Matter admit that. There's a video where Patricia Cullors says that we leaders of Black Lives Matter are trained Marxists, as opposed to untrained Marxists. But what that means is that we are activists. We are actively trying to undermine American society because we take it to be systemically racist, thoroughly corrupt, and it has to be overturned completely. So that's Marxist language. So I talk about this in the chapter, Fire in the Mind of Karl Marx and his followers, and I deal with basic Marxism and then how it has morphed into critical theory and then what's called critical race theory. So the short story is that Marxism is a atheistic worldview developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who was the rich capitalist who kept Marx in business because Marx never held down a normal job. He would write and try to agitate for revolution, but he didn't have any lucrative employment. So his parents, any gainful employment, his parents and Engels supported him. But the idea is that history is about class struggle. The most important aspect of life is economics. Owners oppress the workers, and eventually the workers will rise up in revolution. These are called the proletariat. They will revolt against the owners who control the means of production, the bourgeois class, and there will be an overturning of this unjust society, this structure, and the workers will create what's called the dictatorship of the proletariat. And eventually, now that there's no private property, no profit motive, oppression will cease and we'll find ourselves in a classless society without any conflict and even without the division of labor. Now, of course, that never happened. And the Marxist revolutions in Russia and China actually didn't proceed according to the Marxist playbook at all. Right. They're much more top-down, not bottom-up kind of movements. And they led to terrible repression and systemic killing and imprisoning of dissenters. So there's a big book came out 20 years ago called The Black Book of Communism. And that book estimates that 100 million human beings were slaughtered by their own civil government in the 20th century by Marxist governments. This is the USSR, China, Cambodia, and other places. So in the 1920s, there are a group of Marxists in Germany, in Frankfurt, Germany, people like Herbert Marcuse, 20s and 30s, Max Horkheimer, Erich Fromm, and others. And they realized that Marxism was not playing out the way they thought it should, especially in America and the West, where the workers were supposed to be exploited. They should be fed up by now. They should be engaging in revolutionary activity, and they were not. And so these thinkers, who eventually moved to the U.S. To escape Hitler and Nazism, developed something called critical theory, which was neo-Marxism or cultural Marxism. And they said, well, we need to do several things. We need to show that people are oppressed not only economically, the workers by the owners, but they are oppressed in terms of race and gender. So if you are a person of color in the United States, you are oppressed and you must become a revolutionary. If you're part of a sexual minority, then you are oppressed and you must become a revolutionary. And moreover, the revolution has to not only be from the bottom up, but it has to be wrought through the institutions. So there's this idea of an Italian thinker named Gramsci, Antonio Gramsci, that this is not actually his phrase, but it's his idea. We need to engage in a long march through the institutions. So the institutions of politics, of media, of education.
Did Mao borrow that long march phrase from him? Because I know he died, I think, before the actual long march happened.
I'm not sure, but the idea is that if you are part of traditional society, you believe in the traditional family and Judeo-Christian approach to life, then you are part of the oppressive class. You are an oppressor. So the oppressors are the owners, white males, especially white male Christian people that own property, or especially if they're very wealthy. So what's wrong with society is that the oppressors need to be overturned. They need to be opposed, and those who are being oppressed need to come against them. So it's really one class or one group versus another group. It has to do with economic class. It also has to do with race, gender, and religion. So what eventually happened is that you have Marxism, then you have critical theory, particularly advanced by Herbert Marcuse, who is the leading philosopher of the New Left in the 1960s in the West. And then along the line, this got developed into what's called critical race theory.
Can I interrupt 1 second?
Yeah.
Because there's something that kind of happens in between, which was the realization that in America, these uprisings would not really occur. So that's one of the reasons why you have the march to the institutions. The other is John Dewey really came to the realization that you had to prepare culture through the educational system. And so they kind of trained through the public school system, the population into embracing Marxism. And I often have to point it out because I have so many people contact me and go, how did this happen so quickly? And I have to say it didn't. It's been 100 years in process.
Right. Oh, yeah, it has definitely. And let me give an example of this. I got my undergraduate degree and my PhD at the University of Oregon, Eugene, Oregon. And this is about the same political cultural level as Boulder. You know, the People's Republic of Boulder is very liberal. And there's a great bookstore there called Smith Family Bookstore, right off of campus, 2 blocks from campus. And they had an entire section of the bookstore on Marxism. It wasn't just a subsection of the philosophy section. It was an entire section, hundreds and hundreds of books on Marxism.
It's like 40 years ago, right? Roughly?
Well, I graduated with my undergrad in 1979, my PhD in 1993. So Marxism and extreme leftism has been infiltrating and really dominating secular campuses for a very long time. And Dewey wanted to bring about a socialist society through education. He was an atheist. He believed that education was not training people to think critically using the trivium and the quadrivium, the classical tradition. He wanted people to be socialized to become good socialist citizens. And Mark Levin's book, American Marxism, goes into quite a bit of detail about the role of John Dewey. Also, to go back many years to a very thorough, very profound book, R.J. Rushdoony's book, The Messianic Character of American Education, goes into a lot of detail about Dewey and others, and the fact that public education in the United States has a very secular and very messianic focus and trajectory. The idea that we will make a certain kind of citizen through compulsory education.
Right.
So I think we need to be very critical.
Earlier, you said Engels subsidized Marx's lifestyle, basically. So could you say, how would we complete this sentence? Engels was to Marx as Soros is to
progressive
about
prosecutors.
Everybody, right? Everybody was
the Democratic Party. Yeah, pretty much.
If Engels had been a billionaire, multi-billionaire, he probably could have done a lot more than just subsidize Marx.
Right. Right.
Now, one of the questions that's come up here, I'd like to pose, because Ron and I have talked about this in the past, is the difference between Leninism, Maoism, etc., as branches of Marxism. And one of the things Ron had said several years ago is it's really like talking about, I don't know, tissue. You have various brands of the same tissue. Is that kind of a good description of what's going on here? Marxism versus Maoism versus whatever.
Yeah. Well, the germ of the thought, the real root, is Marxism, developed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, and there are many books, and of course popularized with their incendiary booklet, the Communist Manifesto, which I read as a freshman in college. And as a non-Christian and someone who just kind of instinctively leaned left because I didn't know any better, I thought, well, this must be right. Society's unjust, people exploit others, the wealthy exploit the poor, etc. But this was developed in different ways. With Lenin in the Bolsheviks revolution, you had a conflict between Lenin and Trotsky, and Lenin won out, Trotsky was exiled. And Lenin developed the theory. He added elements of the international aspect of it. So the idea was that capitalists will not only exploit their own people, but they would seek to exploit those in other countries as well. So workers of the world unite, the world, that's part of the Communist Manifesto. But Lenin developed some theories related to the international ascendancy of communism. And of course, Mao had his own version of this. But the essential idea is atheistic. Economics is the driver of society, and any kind of protest against the revolutionary vanguard is not permitted. So go back to the Communist Manifesto. There's a line there that the bourgeois need to be swept away and rendered impossible. So it's not the idea that we're going to out-argue our political opponents. That's the classical American idea of free speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. That's not a part of Marxism at all. And that's why the Marxist governments always oppress their own people, because when their own people say, this is not working, we're starving, we're not getting richer, it's unfair, you're repressing our religion, they don't say, well, let's have a town square, or you write your books and we'll write our books. They'll say, no, you must obey, or you are a counter-revolutionary, you have false consciousness. So we have to either re-educate you, exile you, or kill you. That's how this ideology works. It is utterly opposed to the American idea of God giving us certain inalienable rights.
Right.
It's opposed to the 5 freedoms of the First Amendment. It's not just another political view. It is a revolutionary, anti-American, anti-Christian worldview.
So that's where cancel culture really arises from then. They cannot actually argue through differing ideas to see which one is more valid, for example. What they have to do is just say, no, you don't even have the right to speak. We're going to cancel you.
Yeah, that's it. So I have a chapter called Ideology and the Torching of Free Speech, chapter 5 in the book, Fire in the Streets. And this was very clearly stated back in the 1960s by a leading critical theorist named Herbert Marcuse, who started in Germany, then went to Columbia, I believe, and ended up in Berkeley. And he was the mentor to Angela Davis, the revolutionary activist who became a professor, who then became a mentor to Black Lives Matter leaders. But Marcuse published an essay called Repressive Tolerance. And he said, we shouldn't tolerate every idea. we must not tolerate the ideas of the oppressors, any conservative ideas. Because if we tolerate that, it will further the kind of institutional structural oppression that already exists. So he's in the theory, he's in the spirit of Marx. They have to be swept away and rendered impossible. So we shut them down. We silence them. We put the duct tape in their mouth.
We have really shifted a long way over the last, 40 years. Ron will remember this, and you may or may not, but back in the day, there was a big hoopla. It was national news about the Nazi Party marching through Skokie.
Oh, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And the citizens who lived in Skokie were, of course, actually the whole town was up in arms about it. And yet the courts ruled that they had a right to that march. Mm-hmm. That was part of free expression.
The
ACLU argued for them, correct? Yeah. You would never see it happening today. Well, maybe for the Nazis you might, but for conservatives, no, it's cancel culture, help them lose their job and go away, versus the free exchange of ideas. Mm-hmm. And this plays a lot into that, correct?
Oh, certainly. The historic view of the American Civil Liberties Union, whatever you think of them, was to defend, not defriend, that's today, to defend free speech, whoever is making the speech.
Right.
As long as it's not outside of the law, like making threats or something like that. And Alan Dershowitz, who was very involved with the ACLU for many years,
right.
is now opposed to it because they don't do that anymore. They've gone woke. They don't think that some people have the right to free speech or that free speech is dangerous. Or Abraham X. Kendi says, you don't have a right to tell a lie. Okay, well, wait a minute. Who's determining what is a lie and who isn't? And moreover, free speech allows for the possibility of bad speech. So the answer to that is not to repress the speech, but to have more speech.
More speech.
Back in the day, before Marxism had hegemony in the academy, free speech worked in their favor. It allowed them to spread their views. Now that they have hegemony in the academy, it's not a good thing. You just have to repress it.
That's it. It's exactly right. It's very similar to how often Muslim activists work. They will go into a non-Muslim country and use freedom of speech to establish the influence of Islam. And then once Islam is established, they begin to try to crack down on the expression of non-Muslims. That could be Lebanon. That could be at least the goal of many radical Muslims in the United States. So we use it in order to eventually undermine it.
We cynically use it. We have no intention. We will argue for it. We will claim we are defenders of free speech until it's not necessary for us anymore, and then we will attack it.
Right. That's it. Yeah, so one of the stated goals of the book is not only to critique critical race theory, but to present something in its place. So if critical race theory is unholy fire, then I want to offer a holy fire, ultimately a Christian worldview that explains who we are in the world and gives us the best foundation for civil society, but then also what is best about the American system. Because we have to be aware about this, because the activists in critical race theory are not just trying to change a few things around the edges about the United States. They are trying to burn down the whole founding philosophy of the United States. They say the U.S. was not founded with the Declaration of Independence. It was founded on slavery in 1619, when the first slaves were brought to the United States. It was not the United States at the time, to the colonies. And so what they're trying to do is discredit or delegitimize not just a few politicians or ideas, but the entire American system. So part of what I do in the book is to say that the American system has a very strong foundation, and also it has been able to reform itself over time. The Declaration establishes objective rights for human beings. That is the why of America, and the Constitution is the how of America. What are our rights? It allows for amendments. So the idea is not that we're going to create a document that is set in stone and never could be revised. No, we're fallen, finite human beings. So the United States permitted slavery for a very long time. It was evil. Yes, slaveholders were involved in the founding of our country, but Jefferson was conflicted about it. And you could say, well, he was just a hypocritical white slave owner. The Declaration means nothing. Well, it's possible to write better than you live. I think I've done it myself.
Absolutely.
I don't own any slaves, obviously, but you can realize that ideals are good and true, and you don't live up to them. So it's a very jaded, just false and irrational idea and dangerous idea to say the founders were compromised on slavery, and so the whole system is compromised. Well, I go to people like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, and Martin Luther King, who affirm the founding ideals of the United States in the Declaration and in the Constitution. When Martin Luther King was giving his famous speech at the Capitol of the United States in 1963, I believe it was, he talked about the magnificent documents of the Declaration and the Constitution. And he said, we're here to cash a check. Black folks are created equal along with white folks and everybody else. And critical race theory does not affirm that at all.
Right.
People like Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and others, Richard Delgado, they'll say, no, racism is a part of American society. It's always been, it's baked in. That's a term you hear quite a bit. And I'd say racism exists because we're sinners, we're fallen. We can be racist, white against black, black against white, yellow against white, whatever it is. People can be racist because they're sinners. And sometimes racism congeals into a structure, as it did in the U.S. with slavery, with Jim Crow and so on. However, the U.S. system allows for improvement and reform. So we don't need to burn it all down. The Civil War was bad enough, okay? We don't need to burn everything down and try to start over again from year zero, the way the French revolutionaries did.
Well, there is a sort of a citizen mutual accountability, as I understand it, at least as I grew up. I mean, it's interesting that you raised Alan Dershowitz. Joy and I really love Alan Dershowitz.
Yeah.
And several have asked me, how come he's moving so conservative? And I said, he's not.
Right.
He's a classic liberal. He hasn't shifted his views. It's progressives that have shifted away from classic liberalism. So don't make a mistake. He's not conservative. Classic liberals saw the same problems that we saw. They just had different solutions to those problems.
Right. Well, and the difference is that someone like an Alan Dershowitz believes in the American system, that is, in our protocols. So Dershowitz wants to ask of any political action or any law, is it constitutional? Right? And someone who has very different specific political views, like Mark Levin, will always ask the same question: is it constitutional?
Right.
You know, I love it when Levin gets upset. He says, "It's unconstitutional." That's right, I said it.
It sounds like the Affleck quite a bit. So,
but you know, you have a Dershowitz who voted for Biden but defended Trump's rights in court, right?
Right.
And then you have a Mark Levin who wouldn't vote for Biden and vote for Trump, but they both believe in the founding ideals of the country, that we're given a legitimate way to work through our differences according to the Constitution. And may the best argument win, may the best lawyers win, right? That's not critical race theory. That's entirely different, because Marxism cannot abide, whether it's original or cultural Marxism, it cannot abide a system that allows for private property, profit, and so on. It has to be torn down. So actually, I start the book by referring to an interview that was done about 2 years ago on National Public Radio, interviewing an author who wrote a book called In Defense of Looting. In Defense of Looting. And she said, the whole system is corrupt. If people have property, they stole it from other people. And if you don't have as much property or money as other people, then you can just go, to use old 60s language, liberate their property. She didn't use that phrase, I don't think, because it's yours. It's your due to have that property.
They owe it to you, and insurance companies will pay for it anyway.
Right.
Right. That was that's how she sold it.
Now there are those, Doug, that are trying to figure out how to survive and thrive in this whole idea of critical race theory, and one of our sponsors actually has some comments on that.
Yeah, recently in an emergency meeting at the Toxico Corporation, the project lead Stu said these protests are delaying the project and killing our bottom line. Foreman Larry said, all this over a few million dead fish. PR spokesperson Pam said, yeah, we're the real victims here. Meanwhile, across town, a hedge fund manager consults with his lawyer. I feel so left out of the culture wars. I can't afford to be left behind. But where do I find the right victim status to bring me the professional success I'm looking for? Meanwhile, Phil is meeting with his career counselor. I've come to the point where I realize I don't have enough intersectionality on my resume. Do you think I should consider gender reassignment surgery to boost my job prospects? I quoted it, but I didn't show it. In any case, now there's a solution for all these problems. The grievance industrial complex. The grievance industrial complex provides it's the premier manufacturer and recycler of fine grievance products. It provides grievances customized for your political, economic, and social goals, and it works closely with you throughout the design and implementation process to ensure your satisfaction. And all grievance industrial complex products come with free moral high ground, which includes victim status, identity politics tactics, flawless far left ideology, and so much more. And free for a limited time, the Moron's Guide to Playing the Victim card for terrorists. It's endorsed by Dr. S.J.W. Jones is even better than the Harry Potter series, the grievance industrial complex, because things are never bad enough already. So,
sign me up.
I would go right. I would just go get those.
I'm a white male Christian professor. I need help.
We need it now more than ever, I think.
You need help, and we have Dr. Doug Groothuis. We're talking about his book. There you are. Fire in the Streets, how you can confidently respond to incendiary cultural topics. And I would say you really want to get that book. I have it on Audible, which is how I first listened to it. And now I have a PDF of it and a Kindle version. So I have, triple value for the book.
So have we actually worked our way into section 3 now, where
we just did 5. No, now we're section 3, and I do want to ask a question. What is this 5 there? Yeah, we just did 5, chapter 5. I want to ask the question on maybe race and identity for a second, and I'll tell you why. I have a vested interest in this topic because I read concurrently with, or successively, whatever, I read Doug's book, and immediately after I read another one, Inconvenient Minority by Daniel Zhu, I believe it is, which I really recommend. And he's talking about the issues of the plight of Asians, let's say, who are really being discriminated against more than probably any other group at the moment. And if they raise the issue of that, they are then told that, well, you're white adjacent, so you just deserve what you get. Right. What about that?
Yes, I don't deal with that at length in my book, although I do refer to the book you just mentioned, An Inconvenient Minority. And I do so when I challenge affirmative action strategies in higher education, because secular universities have a 3-tier, or at least 3-tier, schema for admitting people. So the highest level is for Asians, and then whites, and then I think Hispanics, and then African Americans. So 3 or 4. Instead of meritocracy, okay, we won't worry about your skin color, your ethnicity. It's just, can you perform on this test? It's stratified by skin color, right? So Asians, by and large, in the United States, we're talking about Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, tend to perform very well on standardized tests, and also they tend to achieve quite well in terms of incomes and representation in professions and so on. Now, you could say, well, could that be cultural values? Could that be the value of hard work, delaying gratification, valuing marriage? Could that be it? Well, no, critical race theory says, well, they're white adjacent. So whiteness is bad and whiteness is oppressive. And so if you are a person of color and you somehow achieve a lot and do well in society, then it must be because you're somehow a parasite on whiteness, on white people. That's the only way you could actually get this power and influence. And that is such a toxic, just false, irrational view of society. Race plays a role, and there still is racial discrimination, no question. But how are we going to try to set up a somewhat fair and just society? Is it going to be targeting everybody according to their race and making whiteness the worst thing that ever happened to society or to the world? Or is it going to be by saying, wait a minute, we are given by our creator certain inalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Everybody, red, yellow, black, and white. You know, that's the old children's song, Jesus loves little children, red and yellow, black and white. I said that on a program and somebody said, oh, you're a racist because you left out a few colors. Okay, I'm sorry. Add the rest of the colors. Put them in there. So I think the best way of approaching this is to say, do we have laws that are fair for everybody? The laws are not color-coded. And then do we assess people by virtue of their abilities and achievements? I think that's the American way. I think that makes more sense. That I think produces more social harmony among people. And I argue that in the book. So, you know, the issue is, can you come to America, whatever color you are, and take advantage of our system, work hard, delay gratification, don't get arrested, keep the job that you get, and you can succeed. Right? That's part of the...
You know, it's interesting that you raise that, because Ron brought up a subject, I think it was before we went on, which is the group that seems to be accelerating the most in terms of degrees and finances?
Nigerian Americans.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess they're white adjacent too.
They look the most black of all the white adjacent ones that I've seen. We kind of, maybe we skipped over chapter 6, shall we set a flames to the free market. But I've been having some thoughts here. It seems like the 80s kind of gave at least me the vocabulary for talking about this, where I learned the term supply side economics, and I learned what it means. And I think what we're dealing with here, personally, is Marxism and all of these, revolutionary ideas, maybe going back to the French Revolution, are really what you could just refer to them as demand side economics. And demand side economics assumes scarcity. It assumes that we have this pie, we've got to divide it up as fairly as possible. And then when we move in all these other issues now in cultural Marxism or critical theory or whatever, critical race theory, then now we say, well, you've been getting a smaller piece of the pie all this time. We're going to now give you a bigger piece of the pie. And this, what I'm going to call demeritocracy, it dovetails perfectly. It fits like hand in glove. We have to take away meritocracy, and really, when you do that, what are you left with? There is no such thing as a neutral approach,
right,
to merit. It's either meritocracy. I'm going to base it on what you do, or what your past history of consumption has been, or it's going to be this other thing, which ends up being demeritocracy because you don't have to work for it. You don't have to do anything for it. You just have to be a victim.
Right.
Whereas supply side economics assumes that scarcity can be fixed. How do you fix it? Through meritocracy.
Right. Well, Thomas Sowell and others have said that scarcity is the essential principle of economics, that we don't have as much of what we want of anything, basically. But then, and that comes from the fall, Genesis 3, then the issue is, how do you best develop a society economically given the fact of scarcity? Do you try to control it from the top down and apportion goods and services from a gigantic bureaucracy, call it, something like Big Brother, or do you allow freedom for private property, profit, development of resources, savings? And what I argue in my book is, first of all, critical race theory is absolutely hostile to the free market. Abraham X. Kendi claims that capitalism always leads to racism. So capitalism is a sufficient condition for racism. He thinks racism can exist under socialism, but he thinks that if it's capitalist, it's racist. And he thinks that America's wealth is based on the racism of capitalism. Now, that is simply not true. I argue against that. But a free market that has fair conditions with laws and so on allows for the development of human abilities, for the accumulation of capital, for investment, for individual initiative. And the idea on the left is that wealth is a static quantum. So if some wealthy people have a lot of that wealth, they have taken it away from people who don't have as much money. It's called a zero-sum game. And actually, wealth doesn't work like that. Wealth is acquired and wealth is created. So you can be a startup with very little money. And if you come up with a good idea and a solid marketing plan, you can create a gigantic, very wealthy, very prosperous institution. So I don't think socialism is the answer. See, critical race theory says, look, without socialism, we can't have equity. And equity does not mean equality of opportunity. Equity means sameness of outcome. So if we have X percentage of people who are African American or Hispanic, then we have to have X percentage in every aspect of society. In airline pilots, in politics, in dentistry, whatever it is, we have to have it. And if there's not a proportional representation in every area, then it's because of racism. This is what Abraham X. Kendi says in his terrible book, How to Be an Anti-Racist. He says everybody's equal, and there are outcomes that are not equal. So that means it must be due to racism. You know, the guy's supposed to be a social scientist. He's a historian.
No,
that is not the way society works.
I mean, you know, these statements, capitalism equals racism, unproven statements, but not only the unproven statements, but they exist within a system that resists proof. It resists examination. It actively says, to examine my statement means you're a racist, makes you an enemy. So we're dealing with a totalist, a totalitarian, totalizing system. We're dealing with, what was it? Or Lifton's book, The Psychology of Totalism. We're dealing with the very thing that books and dissertations were written about back in the 50s as we faced this threat across the ocean, because it was, there's a controversy about whether brainwashing actually occurred or was attempted, but I think there's pretty good evidence it was attempted on American troops. And, and this, we saw the threat, and we labeled it both totalitarianism, totalism, a totalistic way of thinking. It's an all or nothing, win-lose, there is no examining this. And now it's here. And it's coming after us.
Well, I address that most specifically in Chapter 5, Ideology and the Torching of Free Speech. And we see it with cancel culture. It's not so much that we will try to argue against someone, is that we will give them a label like homophobic, transphobic, racist, whatever it is, and then make sure they no longer have a platform. So I defend the idea of an open marketplace of ideas. Critical race theory, people say that's a myth, that's not real. And in fact, it's all rigged for the oppressors to oppress others.
We had a little section in our book on Bill Gothard that Ron kind of led the way on that one. And it's the the art of name calling, and how that really distracts from the argument, because what happens is you end up trying to defend yourselves against the name calling. And so you don't really get to the issues. Now, for me, it's a little easier because I just state, you could be right. I might be racist. And I'm short and fat as well. My kids could tell you other really bad things about me. I'll give you their phone number. The question is, am I wrong? So I want to get back to the basic argument. They can call me any name they want. I don't really care.
But there's a history here too, Don, that is, in a way, it's being weaponized against us today. Let's put it that way. I was going to say coming back to bite us, but no, that's not what's happening. They're weaponizing the history. And, in the Deep South, the word Marxist was used as a weapon against the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. Now, they weren't absolutely 100% disingenuous. They were disingenuous, but it wasn't 100% because there were segments of the civil rights movement that were Marxist, and some people perceived a drift in Martin Luther King toward the very end of his life in that direction, but we never really got to see whether it would come to that with him because he was assassinated. So it wasn't absolutely totally, completely pulled out of thin air. But it was wrong. I mean, really, Marxism wasn't the issue in the civil rights movement, but it was used. So people will pull out, and you've seen this in major publications where they're showing protesters in the South protesting, counter-protesters, that is, saying we don't want this Marxist civil rights movement. And now that we have an ideology that really is Marxist, at least in its ancestry, they're pulling these signs out from the Deep South in the 50s, and we need to respond to that. We just have to call it for what it is. It is deceitful.
Right. Well, Marxists will piggyback on any movement that tries to overthrow the existing free market Judeo-Christian system. They do this all the time. Paul Kenger has a very good book. He's an expert on communism. He has a book called, what is it called? The Intelligent Person's Guide to Communism or something like that. And he points this out repeatedly. The Marxists tried to win over people of color in the U.S. They tried to win over sexual minorities to be a part of their cause. And so they will be parasites on any movement they think will destabilize the United States, right? But King was no Marxist. He came towards the end of his life to speak against the Vietnam War and so on. And he certainly was on the left politically. But the thing is, like we mentioned earlier, Alan Dershowitz, he believed in the American system. He talked about the magnificent documents of the Declaration and the Constitution. So to label him a Marxist and therefore reject him because of that is absurd.
Yeah.
Right? Now, maybe some of the people in his larger group were Marxists, but you can't control the fellow travelers.
Right. He made alliances with a lot of people he didn't agree with.
Sure. Now, I want to make just a slight turn here, and we knew going in that we wouldn't be able to cover everything in the book, and that's the purpose of buying the book, because then you can read it all.
Right.
That's right.
Right. But Joe Whitchurch, first, Ronnie likes your zero-sum gain.
Thank you, Joe.
By the way, on that, it should be noted that one of the things that Marxists tend to do is convey the idea that there's a limited size of the pie. It's finite.
Yeah.
Where in capitalism, the pie can actually grow and multiply as the economy grows.
Yeah, I should have said, demand side economics assumes that scarcity is a permanent feature of reality.
But here's the question. What does Doug Groothuis say about Christian worldview solution? And that really is kind of key to the whole question. It isn't simply, is there a different kind of way to look at this than Marxism, but is there a view that we would say argue comes from God?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And what does that look like?
Well, I assume a Christian worldview, or I bring a Christian worldview to bear on my analysis throughout the book. But chapter 8 is called A Christian Framework. And I give a miniature apologetic for Christianity in that chapter related to the idea of truth, that God made us to know the truth in a rational world, truth is available. I speak of the scientific evidence for God through Big Bang cosmology and fine-tuning. And then I also say that the Christian worldview gives us a realistic view of human nature and civil government, right, that we will never create a utopia because of what Kant called the crooked timber of humanity, which we talk about in terms of the fall. We have a bent towards selfishness. So you can't create a perfect society from imperfect people. However, we do believe that there is absolute truth based on the character of God, and that we do have certain inalienable rights given to us from God. So a Christian political theory is going to be one of a limited civil government. The government cannot create utopia, can't control, regulate, and tax everything to create a wonderful society. And that kind of a government will respect intrinsic human rights because we bear the image and likeness of God. And so I not only critique Marxism, neo-Marxism, critical theory, critical race theory, but I also advocate or defend a Christian worldview as applied to our social, political, economic problems today. So it's not just a negative, there's a strong positive too in the book.
You know, back in the 60s and 70s, I remember, you know, when we still thought the Red Menace, I mean, they could take us over. We thought we could lose. We were mainly thinking militarily, but we also were still aware that there were, you know, cell groups and so on that were in the United States. One of the things I really vividly recall is just how impressed people were at the dedication of these people, just how, especially when we looked over at Vietnam and what they were sacrificing, what the rank and file, what millions of rank and file people were willing to sacrifice for really what boils down to a religion, a religious outlook on what man can achieve, you know. And I think, though, what we've seen time and time again, I think this is what brought down the Soviet Union. I think it is already starting to put cracks into Black Lives Matter, is that the Achilles heel of Marxism, when it attempts to implement itself, the Achilles heel is the greed. I mean, the very thing that they attack capitalism for, the greed of the leaders, particularly. But there's also the greed of the proletariat, the rank and file, comes out in the fact of how little work they do and expect to be, right. You know, I mean, why were the grocery store shelves empty in Moscow in 1989 and 90? Well, the reason was because of the greed of the rank and file. They wanted something for nothing. But the greed of the leaders, I mean, the top 2%, only the top 2 or 3% of the Soviet Union belonged to the Communist Party, and they had access to all kinds of stores. They never went hungry. Right. They never had empty shelves to feed off of. And now here we have the head of Black Lives Matter. How many $1 million mansions does she own?
Well, I think what explains the success of Black Lives Matter is partially what Shelby Steele, who's a great African-American historian, calls white guilt. A lot of liberal white people feel guilty for being white, and they buy the lie that just by being white, you're part of an oppressive structure. And so to try to atone for their own sin, which is never a good idea, they throw money at Black organizations, even an unaccountable neo-Marxist organization like Black Lives Matter. And they have not accounted for their money. They have profited from these massive donations, especially in 2020. And now it looks like, to some extent, their sin is finding them out. But the Marxist answer is a non-answer. It makes things worse because it doesn't get to the heart of the problem. The heart of the problem is sin in the human heart. Right. And the leaders are going to be sinful. So part of the genius of the American system is we have to know how to govern people, and then the governed need to govern the governors, so to speak. That is, we need to hold leaders accountable. So we have 3 branches of government, right? We have a bicameral legislature. So the idea is humans are sinful. If you give any one human or any one branch of government too much power, it will run away with it. So we are a republic with a representational form of government with a constitution.
Right.
And that's about as good as it gets in a fallen world. And if you think it gets a lot better by burning it all down, rioting in the streets, setting up some sort of Marxist utopia after it all burns down, you are completely deceived, and it will do no good for anyone. So I'm an old guy, of course I don't look it, but I'm 65. I've been an anti-communist since I was about 22 years old, and I can smell a Marxist 10 miles away. And I know what Marxism is, and I know what extreme leftism does to a culture, to a society, to a soul. And that's really the basis of this book. This is leftism, this is neo-Marxism, and there is a better way. Yes, own up to our sins as a nation, as individuals. Look at your own heart and see if you have racist sentiments towards anybody. Come to Christ, be forgiven, be given a new mind through the work of Jesus Christ, but don't fall for the lie of Marxism or neo-Marxism.
Right.
Marxism, because it is not healthy, it is not true, it is not rational, and there's a much better way, much better way.
You touched on an issue of a moment or two ago that we are a republic, and it's refreshing to hear that restated again, because I hear so many who say we are a democracy. And I have to point out that actually the framers were opposed to a democracy.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Why were they opposed to a democracy, do you suppose?
Well, because the majority can be wrong. And that becomes just a mobocracy. So you need to have founding principles that are well grounded in a metaphysic. And our founding principles are grounded in the metaphysic of theism with a strong influence of Christianity. And if the founding principles are sound, then they need to be retained. And they need to be administered in a way that gives a voice to the people, the consent of the governed,
right,
but not that the people determine ultimately what is right or wrong. So there are procedures to go through to amending the Constitution or to impeaching a public official. So you have measured processes to use, and this should all be done within a constitutional setting. But just saying the 51% is right about everything is a very foolish way to think about society or anything.
I think, wasn't it 51% that voted for Socrates to drink the poison?
Well, the majority did.
So, I mean, everything in the Constitution, literally everything, is designed to limit power.
Right.
Every feature, now they amended it. They added, they couldn't even, all the states wouldn't agree to join the Union unless 10 amendments were added right up front. So that was done. And those were power limiting amendments, everything. And so now literally everything that the critical theorists and critical race theorists are doing to undermine the Constitution is designed to consolidate their power.
Exactly.
Everything.
That's why it's fundamentally anti-American.
Yeah, it's no more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
and they trade on ignorance, because how many people understand the meaning of the Declaration or the Constitution, or have a decent understanding of how our civil government works or the history of the United States?
Yeah,
these revolutionary movements trade on ignorance, and they traffic in spewing out lies about the United States.
So when they talk about getting rid of the Electoral College, that's to consolidate their power. Guess what comes next after that? Logically, what comes next is we have to get rid of the Senate. The US Senate is based on the same principle.
That's right.
The fact that we have a Senate and a House of Representatives is the same exact power limiting principle that went into the Electoral College.
Yeah.
How do you calculate the Electoral College? By the number of senators and representatives in each state. So, and what happens when we take away the Senate? Well, then the highly populated areas get to lord it over the more lower populated areas.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, the system is a marvelous balance of form and freedom, where we have a limited federal government, and then we have the governments of the individual states, and it's a balance. And the left does not like states to have any independent power whatsoever. That's why they talk about federalizing everything,
right,
codifying everything from the top
right.
down.
Right.
Well, we only the local
consolidating
Yeah.
more and more power, and the ones that need to stop that is the actual government. And here's how I frame that: we, the voter, are the government. We elect people to represent our views and wishes and desires. What has happened, though, is it has been changed to where we elect somebody to become our boss.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not sure where that happened. And I think I have argued, and Ron knows this, I've argued that I think it's a problem in the furniture design in the House and Senate. What happens is they get elected and they go in and they have great ideas and they want to change things, and they sit down in that chair and it sucks their spine right out. I think that's what happens.
Well, when you think of all the people that they owe money to, or that who paid them to be there, yeah. So,
well, we are going to wrap up here. The link to the book is in the description. You really want to get the book. We can't do it justice in an hour.
No.
Fire in the Streets.
This is a signed copy, as you can tell.
I see that. Yeah, you signed it right on the cover.
And to me, what's so important about it is another reason why I'm grateful for this book is because we needed your voice.
Yes.
We needed your voice to be added to this. We need more voices, but yours is crucial, I think. You are in some ways saying what other people are saying, but the fact that it's coming from you is going to be important to a lot of people, including us. So,
and he covers material that others have not really touched on yet,
which is
but
very helpful. Yeah.
And so, and as we watch so much of the church, in fact, Doug was involved in our Enneagram streaming event. As we see so much of the church really gravitating away from a sound theology on the nature of God, the nature of man, the nature of sin, and so forth, this voice in this book is really helpful to say, look, progressivism and Marxism are bad for the country and really for the world in general.
So buy the book.
So buy the book, and what you need to do is to repent before the Lord and get back in contact with the essential biblical doctrines of the faith. Yeah, so Dr. Groothuis, thank you so much. Ron, would you walk us out of here?
Yes, let's give credit to whom credit is due. Our resident cult leader profiler is Neil before me. Our wardrobe manager is See How It Fits You. Culinary services are provided by Chef Ham and Cheese. Our tinfoil hat provisioner is Just In Case. Jehovah's Witnesses coverage comes from Armageddon and D Opposer. Our Mormon archives manager is Polygumus. Our liberal denominations bureau chief is Lucy Goosey. Our transgender issues coverage comes from Ben Hur. Special correspondent for cults based on the Hindenburg disaster and flying turkeys. Oh, dehumanity. Fact-checking supervisor is Yoleg Pulling. Technical assistance comes through Murky Research. Our legal advisors are at the law firm of Dewey, Cheatham and Howe. Our grievance resolution director is Giovanna Pisami. Our director of privacy assurance is Wiretapping. And original idea sourcing comes from Drew A. Blank. The Unknown Webcast is a production of Midwest Christian Outreach, Inc. in cooperation with Emergency Manicure Productions, both of whom are solely responsible for this content, although you will never be able to prove that in a court of law.
Never happen. Now I'm going to get some more coffee for your protection.
Yeah.
See you all later.